All right. We are live. We're missing one. We're missing. There we go. Now we got everybody. All right, wonderful people. We are live. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of Jackson State University and the Margaret Walker Alexander Center. We want to first give thanks and props to Dr. Robbie Luckett for his great leadership of the center for putting this together. So give glad hands and high fives and all the things that y'all do on the Facebook. My name is Ksa Layman. I am a poet, short story writer, and instructor of English here at Jackson State. We have an illustrious panel. So I just want to go through the panel so we can get to our discussion of the celebration of the 75th anniversary of Black Boy by Richard Wright, one of the most seminal works in American letters. So let me introduce the panel that we have, and then we just gonna start with the round of questions. Our first panelist is Brother Kevin Powell. He's a poet, journalist, civil and human rights activist, and author of 14 books. They just let you know the brother never sleeps. His new book is When We Free the World, a short collection of essays plus one poem about the present and future of America. The next brother we have is the esteemed Ksa Layman. He is a Black Southern writer from Jackson, Mississippi, Jacktown, Jaffa. Go ahead. Layman's best-selling memoir, Heavy. That's right, best-selling and award-winning. There we go, best-selling memoir, Heavy American Memoir, won the 2019 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction, the 2018 Christopher Isherwood Prize for Autobiographical Prose, and the Austen Erikson Prize for Excellence in Mental Health Media, and was named one of the 50 best memoirs of the past 50 years by the New York Times. That's what I'm talking about. Coming up next is Brother Charlie Braxton. He is a native of Macomb, Mississippi, PC, Pike County in the house, and a graduate of I Love Jackson State University. He's an internationally noted poet, playwright, and music and culture critic. He has written the play Blues Man, That Artist Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and the critically acclaimed collections of poetry, Ascensions from the Ashes, Cinders Rekindled, and Embers Among the Ashes, poems in haiku manner. There we go. And he was also a former SGA president of Jackson State. And then next we are just glowing with pride and love to have elder sister Julia Wright with us. She is the elder daughter of Richard Wright, an executor of his estate. She is a journalist, essayist, and a very fine poet. If you have not read any of her poetry, go to Ishmael Reed's magazine, Comp. You will see some of her wonderful poetry there. She lives in Southern Europe. That's right, y'all. She is joining us from all the way across the pond. So we're going to be especially sweet to her and let her know we love. We not only love and appreciate the work she's doing, we love and appreciate the fact that she up at this god-awful time in the morning. She is also completing a memoir on her father and writes haiku. And then finally, he doesn't like people to heap praise on him, but I don't care. He about to get a whole heap of praise. He's all up on it. The teacher, the doctor, the master, Dr. Jerry W. Ward Jr. He lives and writes in New Orleans. He's the author of the Katrina Papers, the China Lectures, African-American Literary and Critical Issues, Factual Song, a collection of poems, blogs, and other writings, and he is currently writing Richard Wright, An Unending Hunger for Life. And that's all we need to say. It's time to get on. So here's what we're going to do, y'all. We're going to keep an order so that way everything will flow. And so I know we all may be on each other's screen differently. I'm going to ask a question, and then everybody will get 2 to 3 minutes to answer. We're going to split that time so everybody. So I'm going to go in this order. Whenever I ask a question, we'll go Ms. Wright, then Brother Powell, then Brother Braxton, Brother Layman, and Dr. Ward. Is that cool with everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Excellent. So what we're going to do first is I wanted you guys to just talk a couple of minutes about your first engagement with the text. Tell me where Black Boy met you, where you met Black Boy, and how it impacted you. So, Sister Elder Wright, start us off, and then we'll flow that way.
Okay. So I read that at the Max as part of my work in progress. So I'll go very quickly into that. I was 12. I was in Paris, in my parents' apartment. My parents were out at the theater, and I don't remember anybody else being in the house. And I crept into my father's office where all his books were, and I was allowed to free range all his books. I could choose any book. There was no forbidden book. That was his law. No forbidden book for Julia. Because, of course, in his childhood, they were all forbidden. And that was the day I took the very copy that Jerry showed you down from the shelf. But it didn't have a dust cover. I remember it was midnight blue under the dust cover. And I took that to bed, but I did a detour around into my parents' bedroom because I knew there were chocolate caramels there. And they were stuffed with nuts. And I loved them. And those were forbidden. Not the books, but the caramels. So I stole some to be able to chew them while I was reading Black Boy. And I carried all these goods back into my room, and I went under the blankets, and I started reading with my mouth full of sticky caramel. And I never got past chapter 2, where he says, I got one orange for Christmas. And as I remember, I jumped out of bed and spit up and coughed up the caramel, missing that beautiful first edition by inches. And I didn't take up that book again until I was in my teens.
Wow.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing it. So we're gonna come back and I'm gonna have you tell us when you got to your teens, how did it impact you? So Brother Powell, go ahead and follow up on that.
Wow. Well, I mean, first of all, just thank you all for adding me. I love Richard Wright. I told Miss Wright that in a private email. I didn't. I grew up tremendously poor, just the way Richard Wright described his life in Black Boy. But my mother pushed me educationally, which is how I ended up in the library, like Richard Wright did as a young person. I didn't know that Black writers existed the first 18 years of my life until I got to college. And Richard Wright really absolutely was the first Black writer that I fell in love with, like literally in love with, because of Black Boy, because of Native Son, because of his haiku. I read everything in my hand by Richard Wright. Richard Wright was the first person that I read that looked like me, that I said it was possible. I could do this. I can actually do this. You know, I literally trekked his life so much through that book. My family's from the South. My mother's from South Carolina, so I'm just one generation removed. So the South is very important to me in our history. I remember things stand out to me about the book. Him having to figure out a way to get that library card, that had a profound effect on me. The different ways he had to navigate racism. I felt that Richard Wright, through Black Boy, was teaching me as a Black male how to navigate racism, even though he was born in 1908, and I was born 1908. Am I right? 1908.
Yes.
Yep, 1908. I remember so much about. And then having this intense desire to read, because reading saved his life and reading saved my life. And people ask me, that's one of the singular texts in my entire life, and I've read it several times. It's one of those books I go back to because it's that important to me. And I think Richard Wright is that important because he really was one of the first that spoke so fearlessly. I had never read anyone who wrote like that. I didn't know that we could do that, to say what we actually felt about what we were going through. So, and I'll end it here. I'm not sure if you were there, Dr. Ward, who I love dearly, Dr. Ward, one of my heroes. Back in 1992, when I learned that there was going to be a celebration of people like Richard Wright in Paris, France, me and a Puerto Rican brother, Tony Medina, had no money, but we got on a plane in our 20s and we ended up in Paris, France. And I remember just hearing and seeing people who knew Richard Wright, and seeing you and all these folks. We were too terrified to even approach you all, but I I just need to say, just thank you, because you never know whose lives are being saved when we write something. And his book, Black Boy, saved my life. I can say that. It saved. I'm trying not to get emotional, but
No, that's fine, man. This is the space to be emotional. The space and the time, brother.
it was one of the books that saved my life.
It's okay, Kevin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why we here. That's the testimony we need.
Yeah.
Yeah, brother. So what I'm gonna do is I know Charlie's having some struggles with his phone, and so as soon as he gets those taken care of, we'll come here, and we all here for each other. So, Brother Layman, talk to us about your first encounter with the text.
Yeah, I think first I just want to thank all of y'all, to use Kevin's words, for having a part in saving my life. It's so funny that Richard, Kevin says Richard saved his life, because when I was, a young writer coming up, we were looking for models, and for like on the page, Kevin was a model. The way Kevin seemed to be living his life seemed to be rightish to me, growing up in Jackson, Mississippi. So, Kevin, I want to thank you for saving a Black boy's life in Jackson.
Wow. Thank you.
Grew up in a different era, fam. I mean that so sincerely.
Wow. Thank you.
So, we grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. My mother was a student at Jackson State when I was born. She became a professor. She worked with Margaret Walker a lot. And, I always tell this story, like, she didn't want me reading what I call the good books, like she wanted me reading Silas Marner, Faulkner, like she wanted, and we had, my mother had all of the good books, like the Pan-Africanist books, the Wright books, the Baldwin books, the Morrison books. And, I would have to read Wright. I'd have to sneak when she went to bed, the way some of my friends would sneak and watch Cinemax. I'd have to sneak and read Wright when I was like 11 or 12 years old. And for me, if I'm gonna be honest with y'all, it was the beginning of a contemplation of the fear and anger that I felt as a young person. There were many other emotions, but fear and anger were things I felt, but I did not have like models of really how to contemplate that fear and anger, or really to think about the consequences of the fear and anger that like sort of was just like bubbling up in me. And so I ran into Wright at 11 to 12. And when I ran into Wright at 11 to 12, I remember in every English class that I attended, I would always try to push my teachers to teach Wright. And all my teachers at that point were white, and they wouldn't do it. So me, Wright made me not even want to be a writer initially. He just made me understand that like this desire to fight that I had, that I could only find remnants of in like Scarface at that time, a little bit in Pac, eventually in Biggie. But before that, it was Wright who gave me permission to search for the roots of my anger and my fear. So that's my origin story with Wright.
So much. Dr. Ward.
My encounter with Black Boy occurred when I was an undergraduate at Tougaloo College. And I'm not sure that I truly appreciated at the time what I was reading, but it stuck with me. And as people who have read or heard my remarks when I was surprisingly awarded the Richard Wright Award for Excellence, there is a deep affinity between myself and Richard Wright. We did not come from the same class in Mississippi, but we suffered some of the same wounds. The matter of how do you deal with a family which probably kind of laughs at you for being a nerd, for being a person who reads continuously, and they think something might be wrong with you, and so do your classmates. But both Wright and I, in our very different ways, said, no, we have to be who we are. We have to be who we understand ourselves destined to be. And fortunately, we took different paths, but we turned out okay.
Ashe, amen, and Ashe. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go to our next question, and of course, Dr. Ward was anticipating this question. So I want to start with this question is, we do know that when Black Boy was published, it was not published completely. It was not published in whole. We know that the American Hunter section, So really a two-part question. So I'm ask the first part and let you guys go around the horn, then we'll come back. So just talk to me any way that you want to about your understanding of that section not being included and what it said to you about writing, what it said to you about, quote, liberal whites. Because I always tell people that we love to talk about the South. Let's be clear. It was liberal East Coast Northern white folks who couldn't handle that section, right? Because he wasn't making the North Negro heaven. So there we go with Charlie. How you doing, Charlie? You there?
Okay. Yeah, I still can't see anybody or hear anybody.
Charlie, can you hear us?
That's because I have an interview for the
All right, so let me, I'm looking at that.
So let's try it right now.
Okay.
So, Ms. Wright, let me let you start by any comments you want to make about the American Hunting section not being included, your thoughts about that, what it said about the world then, what it said about the courage of your father to write the way he wanted to write.
Well, my first thought is there should be a book written sooner than later about how much Richard suffered deeply about being cut up, dismembered in his creativity in that way.
Yeah.
It's real dismemberment of one's inspiration. And it's not only American hunger. At the end, when I'll share the news of whatever I'm going to share with you, I'll have another example of this type of dismemberment. And I'd like to jump forward to the last year of his life. Let Jerry and the others address American hunger. But I witnessed firsthand and was old enough and perhaps beginning to be mature enough to understand how much he could suffer from that type of rejection when I watched him cringe. I can't find the words. When he found out that his haiku, in which he had poured his entire self, his blues, his remembering of the South, his hopes that he would live, although he knew he was sick, his love of nature, and it was difficult to love nature because nature was the place where you were hungry.
Right.
Miss Wright, they're asking if you can pull your computer screen down so we can see you.
Can you put your camera down?
I can't. I'm not used to webcams. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I'll hold it with my hand. He had poured all of himself into his haiku, and they had been rejected. But not just a few of them, the total manuscript. And what did the letter say? The letter said, this is not commercially viable. After reading the first few hundred, a quiet monotony sets in, unquote. And I witnessed what it did to my father.
Yeah.
And in my memoir, I write that I think that had his haiku been accepted, he would have been given a new lease on life.
Wow.
The rejection was 1960.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Wright. Brother Powell?
Wow. I mean, wow. I'm basically at the age where Mr. Wright passed. You know, when you think about it, he was so young.
Right.
You know, he was a young. He was young, and he really foreshadowed with his writing. I mean, you asked about American Hunger. I remember I didn't know when I first read Black Boy when I was 18. All I knew was Black Boy. I don't know how I stumbled into American Hunger, other than the fact that I just tried to read everything that was done by Richard Wright at that point. And I thought it was interesting that it was separate from Black Boy. But you're right, you know, because he critiqued the North, the racism of the North. He critiqued the Communist Party that he had been a part of or supported at one point, and that, you know, and I think that there was an effort to try to, you know, just kind of water down who he was by saying, let's just go with Black Boy for now. And I believe it wasn't until Dr. Ward, 1977, is that right? Around that time that American Hunger was actually published. Is that about right?
77, 76. I have to check the dates.
Yeah. But think about that. That's 17 years or so after he passed, and it's 32 years after Black Boy was published.
Right.
And then when I read American Hunger, it was actually reflecting what we were dealing with. I was in college during the 80s when the anti-apartheid movement was going on. And, you know, he was questioning things the way we were questioning things. And we were, you know, the anti-apartheid movement was a progressive, multicultural movement, but there was racism within the anti-apartheid movement, just like there's racism within the Black Lives Movement today. It's the same thing. And I just thought that Richard Wright was so ahead of his time. When you think about not just Black Boy, American Hunger, but the Bandung Conference, all those leaders from around the world, he was an internationalist. He was a global citizen. He was very clear about that. And that was something that really stuck with me. You know, something else, if I can just say this, Miss Wright, she's so right, because it's I wouldn't want to be anything else but a writer. This is what I've always wanted to be since I was a child. I'm clear about that. But to be a Black writer, you know, to be a writer that is woke in every sense of the word woke, and also is committed to telling the truth, is to have a life that it's very difficult. I mean, as you were talking about rejections, I mean, I've counted. People think, oh, Kevin's got 14 books, it must be a piece of cake. I've been rejected so much this year alone, in spite of whatever I published them, because it's just almost like you're constantly having to audition, quote unquote, over and over again to prove your worth. I mean, for Christ's sake, we're talking about Richard Wright, one of the giants of letters in the world, in 1960, getting rejected for his haikus. And it just says a lot about how we are not valued as whole human beings or as full writers as other folks are, you know, because we're not considered part of the canon. And that is reality, and it's hurtful. But I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because no matter what they tried to do to Richard Wright, you know, when he was alive and when he was no longer physically alive, you cannot kill this man's genius, because he's still here. He will always be here.
Thank y'all both so much. Brother Layman?
Yeah, you know, Celie, last time we were talking about this, you said this statement that just sort of reminded us that, you know, you kept saying he was born in 1908 in Mississippi.
Right.
In Mississippi. And I think this sort of almost collective desire to not understand what that means is a lot of what parts of our reading world, I think, did to Wright from the beginning. But I want to talk about like the personal in a different way, because, you know, Wright, I think, has helped all of us develop a better relationship with ourselves. He definitely has for me. But, you know, the first time I talked to my mama about American Hunger and Black Boy, I was like 14 or 15 at the time. And I don't think we talk enough about how Wright's art sometimes allowed some of our relationships to have a bit more integrity. Now, this was an artist my mother did not want me to read because she thought I would be inspired to, quote unquote, act up with white folk. But when I read it all, you know, we had to talk about regionalism. Right. And, you know, this was long before Andre says the South got something to say and all of that. And I just love partially that Wright was from, you know, he was from where I was from. But I just couldn't understand why American Hunger was being taken apart. And my mama just kept, you know, she said at the end of the day, she was like, shit, Key, don't you understand? They scapegoat us. They scapegoat us. And I just like, who? And she was like, them, the people he was writing about in that section. And they had to cut that part of him off because they wanted to scapegoat that part of him. And I think I'm tying that to this idea that, like, we continually forget that the man was born in 1908 in Mississippi. And he wasn't born in no Jackson. You know what I'm saying? He wasn't born in like an urban part of Mississippi. He was born in a very rural part of Mississippi, in something below poverty. So I just want to say, understanding my beginning of understanding Black Boy and American Hunger actually was the beginning of one of the richest points in my relationship with my mama as a young person, and that's another thing I need to be thankful to Wright for.
Amen. I say, Dr. Ward.
I had the good fortune of reviewing American Hunger for the Virginia Quarterly Review, and I tried the best I could to indicate which parts of American Hunger had already been published so that this overblown hype about this being a new discovery was discounted. This was no new discovery. Let me share with you one of the possible reasons that that manuscript was mutilated. One of the excuses used by the Book of the Month Club was that we have a problem. We're in the middle of we haven't recovered from World War II yet, and so we have a paper shortage and we have this, that, and the other. But the real reason came from Dorothy Canfield Fisher, who wrote an introduction for the original, the first edition of Black Boy. And by hook and crook, I got a reprint of the February 1940 Book of the Month Club News.
Wow.
In which she says, Richard Wright stings your nerves taunt. He communicates his anguish to you as by a piercing cry of pain in your physical ears, yet he finishes his book with disciplined self-control and power to spare, so that in the last pages he sweeps his readers out from the concrete and definite with their crushing weight of literal fact into a spacious realm of thought, poetry, beauty, and understanding. That is a neoliberal Northern view. What Mrs. Fisher, Canfield Fisher, could not accept was the fact Richard Wright was not saying, oh, I am very happy to be in Chicago and New York. No. Richard Wright saying, look, in a way that instructs us about analysis in 2020, you look at the entire, you mentioned region, you look at the entire country. You have to look at all of the USA, and you have to confront, painful as it is, the kind of systemic racism that allowed that book to be cut. It was part of a really internal or intra-racial mess of white people in the North wanting to laugh at those people on Tobacco Road.
That's right.
Wanting to laugh at those people, those people Faulkner wrote about, the Stopeses, these degenerate, and I use that word advisedly, degenerate people who are in a caste system they don't even understand because people are exploiting them. So yes, that's what the North wanted to enhance the myth that it was Mecca, that it was salvation. Well, anybody who reads could go back to the stories about New York, about Chicago, about the reports that had to be made in terms of race riots. The North was no Mecca, and I don't know why we call it North, because it seems to forget that we had a Midwest and a West, where things were no better. So what we have to honor Richard Wright for is bravery, courage, fortitude, the will to say what was not popular, and publish the politics of publishing. Let him know, as Julia has said, in no uncertain terms, certain things are not commercially viable.
Right. Thank y'all so much. Charlie, we got you there? You're
I
muted.
can't hear Charlie.
Go ahead.
No, I apologize for the technical snafu.
No problem, brother. Look here, technology works when it wants to. Let me have you just jump right on in there. Just give me some of your thoughts about how you first met Black Boy. Where were you in your growth? How it impacted you, right? That first meeting of the mind of Richard Wright and Black Boy.
I'm ashamed to say that I first came in contact with Richard Wright in college, when I really should have come in contact with him in middle high or junior high. He could have changed my life and explained so much about what was going on in the Macomb, Mississippi in the 70s. But unfortunately, due to the racist attitude that our school system had, Richard Wright's name was only mentioned. His work was not required. So I read him at Jackson State, as I'm quite sure you did, and Kiese, you don't leave Jackson State without reading Richard Wright and Margaret Walker, thankfully. And when I first read it, the first reaction was anger. Because it described what I was going through, what I was feeling in such vivid terms. And it moved me in such a way that I knew that I wanted to be a writer. I just knew I couldn't write like Richard Wright. But it taught me, as Amiri Baraka said, the power of words, how words can move people, how words can be a part of the struggle for liberation. And it made an indelible impression upon me as a writer. What it also showed me was, when I looked around Mississippi, that although the times had changed, the signs were down, the attitudes of Mississippians, white Mississippians, certain sections of Mississippians still exist. And I believe if his work was being taught to people like Pace Price Wallace and Tate Reeves earlier in their lives, perhaps we wouldn't have the struggles that we're having now. Perhaps he wouldn't say we need to succeed from the Union, Price Wallace. And perhaps Tate Reeves wouldn't have such a struggle with changing the state flag, among other things.
Very good. So I want to stay there but pivot just for a moment. And what I want to discuss now is, and both Ms. Wright and Dr. Ward, and all of you did, but specifically talked about Richard Wright's, not just his intelligence, but his ability to use his intelligence to be courageous, to say the things. And because what I love about Blackburn, I like this about all his work. What I love about Wright is everybody gets it. Right? Let's be real clear. If there are just as many Black people salted with Richard Wright as as my grandma said, everybody get it. So what I want you guys to and just address this in your own way. But there's a quote around page 300, 301, 302, where he says that at the Negro Relief Station, quote, of people rejected by the society in which they live, these people were not ready for revolution. Negroes who had given up so completely. And so I just want you to talk about how a man who was willing to tell the truth and to get I always tell people that I will fight, and if I offend anybody, let me know. I love Wright because his fight was twofold. He fought white supremacy and Negro ineptitude. And talk a little bit about how Wright impacted you, being willing to tell the truth no matter whose feelings it might hurt. Miss Wright, I want to start with you, and then we're going to go across Miss Wright, Brother Powell, Braxton, and then Brother Layman and Dr. Ward. So, Miss Wright, please get us started.
I'll be very personal again. He was watching his daughters grow up in France, in a privileged society, in a beautiful home, and he was afraid. He was afraid that we would lose touch with the world that he knew, reality that had made him what he was. And as you said, Celie, the truth outside there, challenging, tough. And so one day, at the end of his life, I had returned to France because I knew he was ill, and I had switched from Cambridge to the Sorbonne, and I went to sociology classes there. And at the Sorbonne, you know, they have those antique rooms that were so crowded and so full that you had, if you wanted to follow the class, you had to climb up on the window ledge if you really wanted to be in the room to hear the professor. So I thought I could do that, and I tried to climb up on the window ledge, and I fell.
Oh.
And I sprained my ankle. So I got back to my father's, and my father said, "But you're limping." And I told him what happened. And he said, "Julia, what are you doing with all those academic things? You're not going to get the truth there. Go out and be a journalist." And this is not against you, Dr. Ward, or against you. I love you people. You make Richard live. You bring life to him. But Richard wasn't an academic, and the only way he could tell his daughter to seek the truth was to tell her to get in touch with reality and to get down from those window ledges.
Amen. That's powerful. Thank you once again, Miss Wright. Brother Powell?
Can you repeat the question? I was so engrossed in what Ms. Wright was saying. What was
Me and
the
you both.
question?
Just how did Wright's ability to challenge both white supremacy
Yes,
and Negro ineptitude, his ability to be so powerful in a time when it could cost him everything, how did that impact you either as a writer or just as a human being?
Oh, I decided at age 18, by the time I finished both Black Boy and Malcolm's autobiography, the rest of my life, activist and writer, and that has been the case since I was 18. Richard Wright, I mean, speak truth to power. You know, it's also not lost on me as I was listening to Miss Wright that three Black men that have had a huge impact on my life, Richard Wright, Malcolm X, and August Wilson, all 8th grade educations, you know, but they were scholars of the world. They were scholars of the community, you know. I think we need people in all spaces, obviously, including academia. But to Ms. Wright's point, what is the point of this education if it's not used for the people? And for me, Richard Wright was a writer for the people. He gave voice to us who didn't think I had a voice. When I'm reading his story, you know, everything from, I mean, I can see it vividly now, you know, when the curtain set on fire in the first chapter, you know what I mean? When the preacher ate all the chicken, y'all know what I'm talking about, all these different things. That in Black Boy, I mean, I could relate to all of that because he was articulating what I felt. Because when the whole notion of the preacher eating all the chicken was me as a little boy questioning what is going on with this Black church, you know. And I agree with what you said originally, Celie, that you know, he not only challenged white supremacy but also Black apathy, Black self-hatred, the internalized racism, you know, because Richard was someone who was able to break through all of that and see a different way. And as Dr. Ward said, you get labeled as a nerd, you get labeled as weird, as if you're the problem. And Richard Wright wasn't the problem. What Richard Wright was, through Black Boy, through his life, in my opinion, was free. Something that we should all aspire to be, which is free.
Right. Very good. Thank you, Brother Powell. Brother Braxton.
Yes, sir.
Talk to us. How did go ahead?
Go ahead. No.
I was just going to reiterate the question. I was just going to reiterate the question. That's all.
Okay. What important to me, Richard Wright taught me three things. He taught me the meaning of truth, speaking it to power, but he also taught me how to analyze the world in which I was living in. He taught me to understand classism and racism and how those two things go hand in hand. You know, like Kevin makes a point about the preacher eating up all the chicken. To me, that was a metaphor of how the church takes resources from the Black community and not give back to them.
Right.
You know, when he deals with that religion, Black religion, which is the main, keep in mind, back then, there were two leaders in the Black community, at least in my community. There was the educator and the preacher.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the main two leaders in our community. They were the Black part of the Black bourgeoisie. And Wright taught me to look at them critically, to analyze what it is that their role in the community and to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Be honest. If it is one thing I learned from Richard Wright is brutal honesty, and it's okay to be mad and express that anger in your work.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, Brother Braxton. Brother Layman, talk to us.
All right. Yeah. I'll be brief on this one. You know, I think like everybody else, Wright definitely taught me the importance of organization if we're going to effectively fight what you call a Negro ineptitude and white supremacy. Organization is something, you know, millions of books have been written about Richard Wright's role and understanding of organization. But again, to me, the real fight was that he showed me that in addition to like organizing, the individual organizer and all of the folk had these interior lives that were worth interrogating, you know? So like when I'm a young boy and I hear LL Cool J say, when I'm alone in my room, sometimes I stare at the wall. And when I hear Scarface say, I sit alone in my four-cornered room staring at candles, like those to me were like homages also to Wright, who showed me as a Black boy that like isolation and contemplation was not antithetical to organizing and to fighting back, but part and parcel of organizing and fighting back. And I just didn't have any other model that put Black boys in four-cornered rooms contemplating the weight of the world at the time. And again, like for that, I am so indebted to Richard Wright. And the fact that he did it again from Mississippi is something I just think we have to contextualize, but we cannot ever forget. It's 1908 we forget. It's Mississippi we forget. And it's Wright's interiority that I think we forget. And so I'm just, because what he did was so spectacular, right? So that's why I'm so thankful also for Miss Wright giving us a little bit more contextualization of that interiority and the way that it played out familiarly, because we know how it played out in our lives artistically. So again, Wright let me know in so many ways, you have to fight with your folk, but at night, you have to contemplate how you can be a better fighter and how also those tender parts of you that you don't want to talk about have to be talked about at some point in some way with art. So
thank you so much. And I'll also add the group War and their song Four Corner Room, right? So you got a whole band of Black men. So now I appreciate you making that connection to Wright. Dr. Ward.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on something that Kiese said about interiority. And this is one of the things that's very important to me right now as I continue to work on Richard Wright. One of the things that I suspect the larger world has never given him proper credit for is being brilliant and having a superior intellect. In the California Newsreel documentary on Richard Wright, I think I've said, I hope I said, uh, he was able to write circles around all of us who had PhDs. And I meant that very sincerely. Because if you understand anything about the academic world, you understand that people in the academic world are not, they're smart, but they batten on the labor, the work, the intelligence, the imagination of people who are severely disadvantaged in the sense of not being able to have university educations. And so they make a great to-do, a fetish, as it were, over the works of these people, but they can't produce those works. They can produce criticism, but they cannot produce those works. Seeley, you also sent us back to page 301. I think this is very important as we continue a struggle in against what I call the unholy trinity of COVID, climate change, and chaos. Wright wrote, and this was a very important thing for him to say, who would give these people a meaningful way of life? He's talking about his fellow African Americans. Communist theory defined these people as the molders of the future of mankind. But the communist speeches I had heard in the park had mocked that definition. These people, of course, were not ready for revolution. They had not abandoned their past lives by choice, but because they simply could not live the old way any longer. And I think this is so important because one of the things I admire so much about Richard Wright is his willingness to say no to Communist Party USA, to say no, I am not going to allow you to control me. And this is all very interestingly illustrated, I think, in The Outsider. I'm not going to allow you to control me. I have to be in control of theory. I have to be in control of Marxism. I will select from Marxism what is very important for me to make an analysis. He's not throwing Marxism out the window. What he is throwing out the window is the racism that was present within the communist scene. He's throwing out, you're going to tell me I have to go and organize. Well, I'm trying to write. Do you not understand that? Do you not understand what writing is? Maybe writing is organizing. As Kiese has said, that helped him to understand what organization was about. So I think what we're at a stage in 2020, and I hope I can make, Julia, a small contribution to this with my work, to say we have read Richard Wright through this lens, that lens, and the other lens. We have gazed upon him, I don't know how many ways, but the one thing we have not spent sufficient time doing is trying to understand how fascinating his mind was that allowed this, in quotation, black boy from Mississippi to become one of the most important thinkers about what's going on, or what went on in the world up to 1960, and certainly about what is happening in the world in 2020.
Yes, indeed. We just need to meditate on that. But Dr. Ward, you got me right where I want to be. Tuesday night, the Mark Walker Alexander Center sponsored a talk with Afrofuturist artist, visual artist John Jennings. And in that discussion, in his definition of Afrofuturism, we really started seeing some fragments of Afrofuturism in Wright's work. So if you come to someone like Samuel Delany, right? So Samuel Delany, one of the foremost Afrofuturists, right? And his work in semiotics, right? So for Samuel Delany, Afrofuturism is all about the battle, that semiotics is the battle because language will shape the future that we have, right? So thinking about that, Dr. Ward and the rest of the panel, I want to take you guys to page 384, which is my favorite quote from it, when Wright said, I would hurl words into the darkness and wait for an echo. And if an echo sounded, no matter how faintly, I would send other words to tell, to march, to fight, to create a sense of the hunger for life that gnaws in us all, to keep alive in our hearts a sense of the inexpressibly human. What I want you guys to address, because to me, that is, I'm not going to say that's Afrofuturism, but if you understand how Delany was dealing with semiotics and how John Jennings and others are talking about how we use art to reshape the future, talk to me in either the way you saw Wright using language to reshape the future, or how he inspired you to use your artistry to reshape the future. So you can address any one of those. And so, again, Elder Sister Wright, I'll let you begin, and then we'll just go around the
horn. To be able to reshape the future, I think we have to first look at the past. And yesterday, I don't know whether some of you listened in on the Black Cinema panel that was organized by Professor Mary Emma Graham. There was a point made during that panel that I thought was very interesting. Of course, my son was one of the people who made that point, so I'm very proud. But anyway, the point was, if you go and watch a Harry Potter film, you go home and you eat ice cream. If you go and watch a black movie, you're on the edge of your seat, even if it's a black movie, if it's a bad movie, because there are higher expectations and the weight of history weighs on what we produce. And I thought that lens of viewing our language and our art, our film, our literature, our painting through the weight of history, 200 years, and the amnesia, because it's too painful to speak about. So we'd rather throw ourselves into the future, running away from a too painful past, than go back and cope with that past, digest it, and speak to it, and make it ours. So I'm just dwelling on that history aspect.
Thank you so much once again, Sister Wright. Charlie and Kevin, you guys have switched spots on me, so I just go with the order I have. So, Brother Braxton, go ahead and speak to that topic any way you want.
Hey, man, I'm so engrossed with what she just said. She said, as my grandmother would say, a mouthful.
There you go.
I think one of the things that's important that Sister Wright pointed out is that in order for you to understand the future, in order for you to go forward, there's this concept called Sankofa. In order to go forward, you have to go back. In other words, you have to know where you've been to map out where you're going to go. Okay. And one of the things that Richard Wright did for me, particularly with Black Boy, his own history, by mapping his own history, he showed me that you can change your conditions by sheer will and sheer intellectual power, that you can move from one spot to another. Doesn't matter where you are. Because when I was reading Richard Wright's work in college, I had no idea that I could become a writer. I had no idea that that possibility existed, because in Macomb growing up, there were no Black writers. Dr. Ward was the first Black writer I met, the first one. So he taught me that it's possible to change your personal conditions, but at the same time, it's important to make sure you use that skill that you have as a writer to help change the people around you by informing them of their past and what's going on in their present, so that they can hopefully map out their future.
No, brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much, Brother Braxton. Brother Powell, talk to us.
Well, I mean, a few things I think about. You can't talk about Richard Wright without talking about what I always say in my lectures: hashtag read, study, travel. Hashtag read, study, travel. Richard Wright was a voracious reader, a student of learning in every way possible. The fact that he was constantly moving. There's Mississippi, there's Memphis, there's Arkansas, there's Chicago, there's New York City, Brooklyn, down the street from where I'm at right now in Brooklyn, New York. He was constantly trying to move forward. And so when I read his book at 18, at 19, at 20, because I read Black Boy several times during my college years at Rutgers, what I was looking for in my past, which was his story, but also the story of all of us, was how do I move forward in my time? I also believe that Richard Wright, as Ms. Wright talked about, Charlie talked about, is this resiliency, because in spite of all the things that are thrown at you, you know, but Laymon talked about white supremacy is real. It is real. It's not disappeared. This country was, quote unquote, founded on it, you know, and what he gave us, even those of us who were not born, I'm born after Richard Wright died, was a blueprint on how to navigate through all of this madness. And still, in spite of only having an 8th grade education formally, how to be a student, a learner your entire life, how to be a creator, a producer, a writer, how to actually talk about what's going on, but also talk about what you want to see, the world that you want to see. I got all of that just from Black Boy, just from Black Boy. Now you start adding all the other things that he wrote, which I also read voraciously. I mean, I would even argue that Richard Wright predicted hip hop. Why did I say that? Because Richard Wright came from poverty. What did Richard Wright do with his life? He made something out of nothing. What's the simple definition of hip hop? Making something out of nothing. So by the time I got to my life as a journalist writing about hip hop, guess who I thought about with every article I wrote on Tupac, Snoop Dogg, any hip hop artist? How would Richard Wright write about Tupac or Snoop Dogg? That's what I was thinking about. Seriously. You know, because I knew that I wasn't just writing about this culture that was of the moment, but that I belonged to a rich tradition that started with me discovering Richard Wright and Black Boy, that I had a responsibility as a writer to document my culture and my people, what it was to be a Black man, the way he was doing it. That's what I had to do.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Thank you, bro, so much, Brother Powell. Brother Layman, come on.
Yeah, fam. Man, y'all are giving me so much life right now. Layla Lalami has this book called Conditional Citizens, and you know, she writes about lots of different groups and folks of color in this nation and how citizenship is so conditional for a lot of us. But one of the things that Layla Lalami does is she makes me think about how a gesture toward patriotism or a hollow patriotism or full patriotism was one of the conditions that the nation had and still has for its Black writers. You can say something critical about the nation, maybe, if you first sort of, you know, valorize Americanness. We saw that in Ellison. We've seen that in Albert Murray. We saw a little bit of it in Baldwin, a lot of it in Baldwin. And what Wright showed me was, one, this refusal in some way to say, like, I don't abide by your conditions. You telling me that I have to love this nation in spite of what it does in order to critique it. I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to do is model a lush love of literature, which necessitates me mastering and exploring styles upon style, you know, to go back to like something Brother Powell said, you know, when Fife talks about styles upon styles upon styles is what I had. Richard Wright, y'all, even though he's talked about as this like naturalist, realist writer, the brother had styles upon styles upon styles upon styles. You look at a book like Uncle Tom's Children, and those of us who dabble in fiction, just look at the styles that were utilized in the creation of that text. Look at the way exposition moves and changes from story to story, yet still you know, he embodies, I think, nature in the way that people grant to Faulkner, while actually still moving story forward and texturizing secondary characters. I just think it's important for me to remind myself, as much as I see Wright as a spectacular, almost superhero, that the dude practiced, and he never wrote the same book twice. And I think that one was a pushback against capitalism, right? Which encourages you to write the same book again if your ass makes a lot of money. And then also it was just an embrace of the importance of artistry and developing who we want to be, particularly as Black folk. And so like it's the styles upon styles upon styles that I, as a writer today, like try to hold with this desire to fight, because I don't think you can effectively fight anyone if you ain't got but one style. And I learned that from Richard Wright.
Ashe. Dr. Ward?
Again, I will pick up on this word style. I would probably replace the word style with analysis. And one of the strong points in Richard Wright was the ability to analyze whatever he was confronting, always preparing himself very thoroughly for his analysis, whether he's writing about domestic workers in New York, being exploited as if they were still on an auction block of a certain kind, or most importantly, in the works from 1954 to his death, Black Power, Pagan Spain, The Color Curtain, White Man Listen. These texts put Richard Wright in a very special position for which he must be honored. He didn't get everything right, but the whole point is he tried. He tried to say, what is it that we must understand about African liberation? The whole continent of Africa is discounted as a you know what by Trump and his administration. The entire continent. Wright understood that if these people in various nations, and this is part of what I'm fearful of about this slight shift from Afro-futurism to African futurism, folks, we better read very carefully. What are you talking about when you tell me African futurism? Surely there is a family relationship among belief systems on that continent, but they are not identical with one another. A person living in Mali does not think like a person living in Kenya. Please understand that. And Richard Wright understood that. He understood why he had to go to Spain to understand how is it that this fascism can be a bedfellow with Roman Catholicism of some kind. How is it that we have these strange mixtures? What is this? And he writes in a way that I, as a Roman Catholic, understand very well. He talks about a catechism. A catechism. How people are catechized, how they are trained, how they are controlled and conditioned. Now, our American catechism is called the U.S. Constitution. So I want to be sure I make myself unpopular. And the Constitution, of course, is well, I won't go off on a tangent because I want to stick to Richard Wright. But I think the important thing is to understand history, as Wright understood history. And what I wanted to mention at the end of this program, 12 Million Black Voices, He talks about it as a folk history. You have to read his introduction very carefully to understand exactly what he's saying. When we talk about history, we were taught in schools, this is what great people in the world did. No, it's not. It's what you and I and everyone on this program is like at this very moment. We are creating the grounds of history. Please let us understand that. I am past tired of these people telling me what history is. I'm making history. You're going to be writing about, you don't have to write about me. You don't have to write about Jerry Ward. You've got to write about all of the people who were making history. Stop selecting out your little heroes like Alexander Hamilton and getting it wrong. Getting it so wrong that Ismail Reed had to correct Mr. Lin-Manuel Miranda. And I really like Reed's play. So Wright showed us the way. Yes, look at Spain, look at the continent of Africa, look at the African Liberation Project. He was urged to do that by his friend George Padmore, but he went to Bandung, and in the color curtain, I do not make Richard Wright out to be a prophet, but I'll be doggone if he didn't prophesy something when he said, it should not be surprising to anyone that these people who are so fanatically religious would have a jihad against the world. Jihad came out as the problem we will not be able to get rid of for several centuries, terrorism.
Ashe. All right. So what we're going to do is we got one more question. Let you guys answer this question, and then Dr. Ward and Dr. Ward and Sister Elder Wright is going to make a couple announcements, and then we'll sign off with whatever last statements you guys want to leave us. I want to set up the last question. I'm not going to get into the history of it, but we were fighting the Ayers case here in Mississippi years ago. And for those of you who don't know, the Ayers case was essentially when the black colleges decided to sue the state of Mississippi because black colleges were meeting the benchmarks, yet the College Board was still refusing to fund us properly. And so this was a fight that went on for 26 years. As I got involved in this fight, as I became a faculty member at Jackson State and got involved in this fight, one of the things that disheartened me is that while at Jackson State, Alcorn, and Valley, because those were the public institutions, we did have a lot of engagement. But I was disenchanted by the number of tenured professors who refused to get involved in this fight. And so I asked one of my mentors, Dr. Ivory Phillips, who's probably one of the greatest minds, along with Dr. Ward. Dr. Ivory Phillips, one of the greatest minds the state of Mississippi, has produced Rosedale, Mississippi, Mississippi Delta in the house. I asked him, I said, why is it that all these black professors with PhDs and tenure refuse to get in this fight? And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, Brother McInnes, because these Negroes think that this little $85,000 or $60,000 that they get will never get it anywhere else, and therefore they are willing to take this change from white folks rather than fight for an even greater treasure. I mention that because now I want to take us to page 281 in Blackboard. And I want to end with the discussion of Wright essentially telling us the importance of pursuing metaphysical hunger over physical hunger. And this is right when Wright had lost his job. And after he lost his job, he said, quote, I had long ago emotionally rejected the world in which I lived, and my reaction was, well, this is the system by which people want the world to run, whether it helps them or not. To me, my losing was only another manifestation of that queer, material way of American living that computed everything in terms of concrete, weight, color, race, fur coats, radios, electric refrigerators, cars, money. It seemed that I simply could not fit into a materialistic life. End quote. I want you to talk to me about how you saw Wright engaging what he saw as a metaphysical hunger being more important than a physical hunger, or addressing it in any way you want, of Wright essentially affirming the words of Yeshua. And for those, Yeshua is the name of the person who you think named is Jesus. Don't worry about it. Don't have your preacher call me. It ain't going to end well for him. But essentially, Wright was affirming Yeshua's point that you do not live by bread alone. And the fact that once any adult, any man or woman understands that you do not live by bread alone, that is a realization that truly makes you a liberator. So talk about Wright doing that, starting again with Sister Elder Wright, and then we'll go around the horn.
I'll go back to Black Boy and just be aware that my father experienced several types of hunger in his childhood. Biological hunger, food, but also affective hunger, the departure of his father, the fact that his mother was growing more and more distant because of her illness, and because he could do nothing to cure her, so the distance between them was growing bigger and bigger, and that was a hunger. Intellectual hunger, as exemplified by Grandma Wilson, who tore him away from listening to Bluebeard on that porch, and what it meant for him to be torn from all that imagination and fire and suspense and the wonder of the narrative. That was a hunger for the end that he never saw, a hunger for answers to questions that he heard the adults discussing lynching without giving lynching a name. The hunger was to understand what was happening when Uncle Silas Hoskins didn't come home. The hunger was to understand. And so these different hungers mixed and fought. And in the end, he found that what satisfied him was what he found in books, the knowledge. The answers to the questions were in the books that he found, and that was his quest. So I love the title that Jerry Ward is choosing for his book, Unending Hunger. That's the intellectual quest. And I don't know if it's metaphysical. I don't know how metaphysical my father ever was, but the search for the intellect was much more important than the furs and the diamonds and the dollars. He died with $800 in his bank.
Thank you so much for that, Sister Elder Wright, once again. Brother Braxton, talk to us.
Hey, repeat the question one more time, because again, I'm doing more listening than I am.
And to kind of, you know, keep it in where Sister Elder Wright had us, that for Wright, satisfying that physical hunger was not nearly as important as satisfying that intellectual or metaphysical hunger. And that passage that I read really seemed to be affirming, right, what Yeshua was saying, that one, we don't live by bread alone. And that the moment that we understand that we don't live by bread alone is the moment that we can no longer be oppressed.
Okay. Well, what I gathered from that is it's important for you to feed your mind and your soul. It's important for you to use the information. Again, I'm going to go back. I keep sounding this, but it doesn't mean anything if I have a belly full and if I have a whole lot of money if my cousin Ray Ray and my neighbors don't have anything.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the struggle for what I gathered from Richard Wright, again, is to use your intellect, find everything that you can, learn everything that you can. I mean, there were times when I was in college when I took my money, which I should have used for food, and bought books.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so again, that's what I learned from him.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's not what you are looking for, but unfortunately, it's what I have.
Now, Charles, that was exactly what I was looking for. No, that was right on point. Brother Powell?
I want to thank you, everyone. I want to thank Mark Walkerson and Dr. Luckett just for having me, Jackson State. This has been incredible. A couple things when I think about that statement you read, that passage you read. This is, and Dr. Ward has talked about it in the brilliant missives that he sends to us through email every week. It's just the incredible dumbing down of America. When you read Richard Wright's Black Boy, it's the opposite of participating in the dumbing down of this world, this society, you know. And when I think about it, you know, it's almost like you get penalized simply for being woke or being conscious or being intelligent or wanting to be intelligent, you know, and you become the problem because you're not actually participating. Richard Wright was not a sheep.
Right.
He was someone who was like, I want to be the shepherd. And you become the shepherd because you read. And when I think back to my own life and how Black Boy probably was the most important thing I could have read at 18, because it was 10 years before when I was 8 years old, and my mother, with her 8th grade education, the same level that Richard Wright had, took me to the library for the first time, and I got a library card and she got a library card. She didn't get any books. She just sat there and let me do what I wanted to do. I didn't realize that experience at 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, 11 years old was actually preparing me for Richard Wright at age 18. And so when I got to Black Boy and I saw myself for the first time in the text, because, you know, it's educational malpractice to go to school K through 12 the way I did, a student K through 12, and not see a single Black or brown or red or yellow or really any women writers either, for that matter, in my entire education till I got to college. Richard Wright opened up the whole world to me. What Richard Wright gave me was an imagination. I was already hungry. It was just misdirected hunger. I was eating junk food. I was eating lies and mythologies.
Right.
I was eating, you know, violence masquerading as American history. You feel what I'm saying? And what Richard Wright gave me was a holistic view, not just of himself, but it was like looking into a mirror. Wait a minute, I'm alive. You know what I mean? I actually matter. My voice actually matters. As Charlie said, I actually can be a writer because he did it. And I didn't realize it at the time, but Black Boy is one of my Bibles, is one of my holy books. That's where I'm going to end it at. It literally has dictated my entire life journey, you know, and I've had to go back several times because Dr. Ward and others are right here. Richard Wright was about the craft. He was a master writer. I now understand why Dr. Ward, you know, has been so hard on folks who were students of his, even folks who were mentees of his like mine, because it's like, and Dr. Ward, you may not remember this. I remember in the 90s when I gave you stuff to write. It's like, I've heard this already. Richard Wright said it. What are you going to say? You know what I'm saying? The challenge is, you know, you need to study Richard Wright and then you need to find your own voice,
Right.
You know? And so that's what I take from Black Boy in that passage, but just Richard Wright in general, is your life should be a constant, you should be hungry for the rest of your life to learn, to absorb, you know, and the whole world should be your classroom. And you should understand that if you have the gift of a voice as a writer, then you have a responsibility historically, culturally, morally, spiritually to use that voice to fight against oppression and injustice and discrimination and hate and anything that is about propping up the 1% at the expense of the rest of us. Because Richard Wright fought against the 1% against the rest of us, which is why they try to erase him and try to say, you know what, he's not that brilliant. He's just angry. I mean, the thing I remember, I'll end it here. They kept saying how angry Richard Wright was. No, he wasn't.
Right.
He wasn't just angry. He was a human being who had a range of emotions, and anger happens to be one of the emotions we should feel, given the oppression that we deal with on a regular basis. But because he also was a genius, brilliant, he was able to articulate what was happening in the world even better than anyone else, because he also cared about people, unlike a lot of folks who masquerade as writers and are considered classic writers.
Ashe. Brother Layman?
Man, and I just want to say thank y'all. Thank y'all so much. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Miss Wright. You know, to reduce it, fam, I think Richard Wright taught me that you have to bite the white hand that thinks it's feeding you, because that white hand is attached to a mouth that is necessarily attempting to consume you.
Right.
But you have to bite back. Do you know? But biting back isn't enough. He taught us that you have to describe the shit that you're biting. You know, when you bite back and we fight back, we have to describe that. And I think that kind of hunger, the hunger that is created when you bite back, or when you refuse to be consumed, I think there's a particular kind of hunger. That's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say is this is holy for me, because I can't think about Black Boy without thinking about Jerry Ward's introduction. Like, to me, has become chapter one of Black Boy, not to be disrespectful to anybody. And I think to craft an introduction worthy of Wright and worthy of that text that meant so much, you have to have hunger, styles upon styles, a desire to love Black people, an internationalist perspective, and also an understanding of like the root and scent of where we come from in the deep dirty South. So I want to just use my last time to say thank you so much, Professor Ward, for what you've done to so many people, but particularly for us who grew up in that Jackson, New Orleans area, who needed models of how to not just interrogate Wright, but how to collaborate with Wright. And we got that model in that book, in that introduction, because the writing in that introduction is, I will say this until I die, some of the most incredible writing ever written, as is Black Boy. So I just want to end it right there.
Dr. Ward, before you begin, I got to throw a little wrench in there. I want you to keep your mind on the question that I asked. I want you to answer that. I just want to add one thing to it. You wrote a poem titled Don't Be Black, Don't Be 14 in Mississippi. And at the end of that poem, you said, when white boys ask you why you don't like them, spit on them with your mouth closed. You don't necessarily have to address that. I just wanted to put that out there as you are addressing the final question of the night.
Well, it's a little difficult for me to grapple with the question anymore, because the question you raised was about materialism and the need not to fall into the cesspool of materialism, and to understand that our struggle is ongoing. I suppose I really want to say that what we must absorb as we read Black Boy, as we read all of Richard Wright's works, is if we're going to select the role of being writers, and I'm going to use this in the very broad sense that Kevin has been pounding into people's heads through his workshops. We are writers. We are writers. The one thing I disagree with, Kevin, is that you can't be judgmental. I'm damn judgmental. And so was Richard Wright. And in a particular way, a good way, not just to say we want to cast shade on people. We want to cast shade on a situation. We want to cast shade on what is systemic in the world. And that was right. Richard Wright was showing us, okay, if you have the ability, the will to investigate, do that. Send those words forth, and maybe you will get the echoes. Now, he did not position himself to say, I'm making any changes in the world. That was left to Kwame Nkrumah. That was left to any of these other world leaders, including that lately, that Idi Amin person. But Julius Nyerere, you think of these people who did magnificent things, Jomo Kenyatta, all of these people to the continent of Africa who made mistakes and whatever, but they were trying to do something. Right now, I'm listening to garbage coming out of the UN about how much progress is being made in Africa, and at the same time, I recently had the horror of watching a film about female circumcision. I had the other horror of watching a film by Simbeni Usman. The Black Girl is translated into English, about this girl who's working for a French family and she commits suicide because of the way they treat her. You see, all of that, you can tell me about your Lovecraft and all this flying panthers and whatever you want. The point should be made that if you are going to deal with materiality, you do not jump into fantasy. Our lives, Black lives, are far too important to trivialize them with fantasies of a future that will never happen. Wright was not saying we should not think about a future. He was saying we need to think about a future, but if you're thinking about it, you better do some planning. You better do what he did. But even more than what he did, and that is to read, to understand who was telling a truth about the past and who was telling a gross lie about the past. And then you bring that to a world audience, and you've done what you have as much as you can do. Because it's up to the world audience to have revolutions, not you. We must not think we can have radical thoughts, but a revolution is not a one-person project, believe me. And we have to also be very much aware that there are people, even who look like us, who are going to be anti-revolutionary, and so we have to deal with that. So one of the reasons, and we're there at the end, I think, I'm not sure.
Yes, I was going to say, this is the time I wanted you and Sister Elder Wright to close us out with the two pieces that you guys wanted to give us at the end.
Right. So Celie, one of the reasons I suggested that we need to look at Native Son, which also has an 80th anniversary, and the 80th anniversary coming up in 2021 for 12 Million Black Voices, because I value in 12 Million Black Voices both the text and photography and how it's used. And we have to remember Tulsa in 2021 and not let people forget that. That's horrible. That was horror. And the horror is still there. I don't know what you say about it. So, yeah, we are not going to celebrate that. We are going to try to interrogate why is it still here in new guises? Why is that wearing a new mask, as it were? That's one of the things we must learn from Richard Wright. Always ask the questions for which you cannot get the answer. You will get responses which will help you to continue to ask the questions. And I think that is his magnificent contribution to our ability to think about world affairs, however horrible they are. You never get the answer. There is no the answer because the world, nature, everything else is in constant flux. So you get a response that may help you to live for a few decades more, but it is up to other people cooperating with you to stem that tide which could overwhelm you.
Sister, Sister Ray.
I'm
Now, I
sorry.
was just going to say, I wanted you to go ahead and close us out because I know you had some other comments you wanted to make at the end.
Oh, yes. So going back to 2008, that was the centennial of his birth, where I think some of you mentioned being in Paris. We brought out A Father's Law, and then I realized that there was a popular demand for other unpublished manuscripts to be brought out. So I went to Yale, and that's where his manuscripts are archived, and I sifted through the manuscripts there. And what stood out in 2010 was one manuscript, and that's where we go back to the beginning, and that is dismemberment. And that's why I chose that manuscript. He had written a novel, not a short story, but a novel, full-sized, called The Man Who Lived Underground, and had submitted it to Harper's. And they had said, we will publish, but we will cut it and only publish the second half in the form of a short story in 8 men. And again, he was confronted with sacrificing the whole beginning of what I believe is a masterpiece. So I chose that manuscript and I brought it back with me to Paris at the time, as well as the essay called Memories of My Grandmother, which explains why he wrote The Man Who Lived Underground. And I approached Library of America, and they said, oh, well, we'll see. And then the years passed, and the years passed. And this is where it gets eerie, and this is where I think history weighs on us. 2020, George Floyd, and how George Floyd dies. And then there was Ahmaud Arbery before that. And then there was Michael Brown before that. And then there was Eric Garner. So when George Floyd died, I said to myself, enough. And I went back to Library of America and I said to them, are you going to publish the first part of The Man Who Lived Underground, which describes how the policeman tortured Fred Daniels, or are you not? And they said, oh, of course, we're going to do it. Absolutely. We're enthusiastic. Oh, this is absolutely wonderful. Because, of course, Black literature had risen to the bestseller lists, and everything that spoke of police brutality was selling. So it's good news and bad news. It's trending. So The Man Who Lived underground gets published because it's riding on a wave. But I'm not going to refuse that because I want it out. And I want Memories of My Grandmother out. And that's beautiful because it also goes back to your discussion of materialism, how Fred Daniels in the underground steals the diamonds, and he steals the dollars, and he steals the watches, all the tokens of materialism from the above world, and he pastes them on the walls, and he laughs, and he laughs, and he laughs. And of course, we, the readers, and maybe even Richard, feel, oh, maybe he's gone crazy. But who defines sanity? The white men. Who said Walter Wallace Jr. was insane when they shot him down with 14 bullets? The white power structure. And was it known that this young man of 29, so-called mentally challenged, was found by autopsy to have had a fresh dislocation of the hip, received probably while he was agonizing or post-mortem?
Mm. Mm. Thank you so much, Sister Elder Wright. Sister Elder Wright, we want to thank you for joining us. For you guys who got here late, she is joining us from across the pond in Europe, where it is at an ungodly hour. So, you know, put up some clap hands, some thumbs up, some whatever you got. Show her some love, but also show some love to this entire panel. Dr. Erikson, Brother Ksa Layman, Brother Kevin Powell, Brother Charlie Braxton, and again, Sister Elder Julia Wright. For Dr. Robbie Luckett, the fearless leader of the Margaret Walker Alexander Center, I want to give a shout out to the entire staff at the center. We saw Angela Stewart, the archivist for the center. Also, the man that you don't get to see, Brother Wheeler, who is doing all the tech work, making sure that Celie don't mess nothing up, don't touch no buttons I ain't supposed to touch. That's why my hands are always down. So, and look, there are so many of y'all in the chat. I don't want to call one person's name because I'm not gonna call one. There's so many of y'all I want to call, but there's so many of y'all out there I don't want to not call somebody. So I guess we're at a point where we can get ready to sign off again. With Dr. Robbie Luckett and the entire staff of the Jackson State University Margaret Walker Alexander Center, Brother Wheeler, thank you so much, brother. And again, Dr. Jerry Ward, Brother Ksa Layman, Brother Kevin Powell, Brother Charlie Braxton, and Elder Sister Julia Wright. My name is Celie McInnes. We will see y'all on the next side. Until then, be safe, take care of each other, love each other, and buy somebody a book for Kwanzaa, Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year's. Buy somebody a book. We need to get back to buying books for gifts. Buy somebody a book. It's Margaret Walker Center. We signing out. Y'all take care. Brother Wheeler, you can get us out of here.